All right, well, welcome everyone. And I'm Kay Kreider. With me tonight is Reverend Deb Holder, and I am with Stewardship for Us, which is a group of consultants that work with congregations on a variety of stewardship matters. We work on things like generally the concept of generosity, annual budget drives, capital campaigns, financial feasibility studies, some mission and vision work, and plan giving, things like that. And we basically help congregations when they contact us to say they'd like to move forward with something and they'd like some help. So all of us are part of the group that used to be part of Wayne Clark's team. He wrote Beyond Fundraising, and that might be a text that you're familiar with, and he retired last year from the UUA. So we are all operating as preferred providers of the UUA, but without Wayne as the contact person because he is now retired. So with that, I will introduce Reverend Deborah Holder, who's on the Pacific Western Region staff.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be with you and have such a good turnout tonight. So I have the privilege and the honor of serving our congregational life staff in the Pacific Western region. And Kay and I have had so much fun putting this together for you tonight. So we hope what we have to share with you is of use in your congregations. And it's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, well, let's get started with some opening words. Beloved community is what happens when we engage our love and our power in a dynamic dance. Navigating the tension between our power and our love is the life work and the soul work that every individual, every group, every culture, and every generation must choose in order to live lives of connection, creativity, joyfulness, vitality, and deep engagement with life. When we are engaged in this work, we experience beloved community. And that's taken from the Beloved Community website that the UUA sponsors and that Deb is very involved with at bethelove.net.
So here's the thing about beloved community. One of the things that's really important to me, and I bet you many of us on the call tonight, feel that we're living in this kind of evolutionary and revolutionary times. So the old world is coming apart at the seams and new ways are trying to be born. So it's kind of a time of accelerated change, and it's more important than ever in this time of accelerated change. Some people call it a awakening, a religious, spiritual reawakening, that we have a clear sense of mission and purpose in our congregations. So Beloved Community offers us a religious vision that can help focus our attention and direct our actions and sustain hope. So a clear sense of mission and purpose, a religious vision, is critically important in this time of evolutionary change. And one of the elements that are really important for that is, and I want to invite you to consider this as a purpose of the church. What if we understand that the purpose of the church is to heal the consequences of lovelessness and injustice in the souls and behaviors of its members so that we can learn to work together towards a more just social and economic order? Because learning to work together is really, really the hard stuff around mission and purpose. And Beloved Community can give us that vision for a clear sense of purpose. In the Beloved Community mindset, if you've visited bethelove.net, you know that we have some reframes, and we understand congregations to be moving from a place of knowers to a place of learning. So moving from knowing to learning communities is really important in terms of fulfilling the purpose of the church in this time. One of the roles of a religious community is to engage in transformational practices. So just like in the day of Dr. King and the Southern freedom struggle, congregations were understood to be learning communities where the Black church membership knew that they had to engage in some kind of new way of being in the world. So they were engaged in these practices where they literally practiced a covenantal ethic. So in the congregations back in the day, and I'm inviting us to pick up that work again in 2015, is that we understood that the role of religious community is to build and restore right relationship. That starts with myself, my relationship to whatever I understand to be the divine, my relationship to the members of my congregation, and the congregation's relationship to the larger community. So right relationship, not only rights, form the basis for social justice work in beloved community.
As a first step, it matters how we treat each other. And that may seem kind of obvious, but sometimes we forget to take the care in our own congregations and for ourselves that we need in order to make sure that we're operating within a compassionate community. Because it's hard to have beloved community beyond your walls if you don't have it within your walls, both within yourself and within your community. And so if you participated in the webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago that Jan and I did, and I know some of you did because I recognized several of your names, we talked about the concepts of generosity in all things, and we picked 5 different areas that we went over, and those relate to this concept of compassionate community. And so when we're talking about generosity in all things, I just want to refer you, if you haven't heard about it, Mark Ewart wrote a book called The Generosity Path, Finding the Richness in Giving. And it's not just about money, it's about lots of generosity-related concepts. But he tells a story about where he was working with someone at his own congregation, and he's at All Souls in DC. And he was annoyed that they were not very organized, and somebody told them to, stop and take a deep breath and say, what is the most generous response that you can have to this situation? And he took a moment to reflect, and he thought, that's a really great idea. And he wears a green string on his wrist that is reminding him generosity in all things. So he's always pausing when he's frustrated, and I know I get frustrated sometimes too, not because I think my way's better, but if you're wanting someone to hurry up or get something done or do it the way that you think would be most efficient, it's tempting to not have a generous response. And so he's always asking, what is the most generous response that I can have to this situation? So that's part of the overview that we want to have for our beloved community, both within and beyond our walls. So the next principle here, we've got develop faith in each other. And I know that the faith word does push buttons for some people, but we want you to think about it in the broader context of faith in each other, faith in our community, faith in our denomination to live out our values and to trust that other people are coming from a good place, and to listen to what they have to say. So we have compassion as related to faith, and we have Brian Stevenson, who's the author of Just Mercy, saying that compassion and mercy are not what we give to others because they deserve it. Mercy and compassion are what we do for ourselves because it's the way we find mercy for ourselves. So either way you look at it, whether you're looking at it in terms of giving compassion to others because they deserve it, or building compassion within yourself that then lets you put that out into the wider community, we want you to think about that concept in terms of developing faith in each other. And it's hard to get compassion and mercy unless you're giving it yourself. Growing our capacity to love each other is also part of this concept, where we are making space for other people that are diverse, that are different from us. And we know in our own communities, in our own faith communities, and in our work life and in our family life, there's a variety of folks that do things differently than we do. They communicate differently than we do. They have a different lens on some things than we do. So thinking about that and growing our capacity to love each other in our diversity is another piece of it. And then just as an overview of it, thinking about in reach before outreach. So before we can put our beloved community out into the wider community beyond our church walls, we need to make sure that we are living out our beloved community within our church walls. And even deeper than that, we're going to go inside ourselves and make sure that we've developed beloved community there, make sure that that's part of what we're doing as a congregation, and then putting that out into the world. And as we go through this webinar, we'll talk about, how some examples of how that has gone out and how we can practice beloved community in our outreach activities.
So here's the thing about mission-centered congregations. If we're experiencing burnout in our leadership roles, in our social change efforts, something's wrong, right? So I just want to invite us to consider that there are new ways that are trying to be born. And one of the most effective ways that we can understand the purpose of the church in terms of healing the consequences of lovelessness and injustice is to do that for one another. So in order to be effective, if we're experiencing burnout, we want to shift our mindset. And mission-centered congregations, as I understand it and have experienced it, we actually invest in equipping ourselves. So first we equip people, so we have some tools in our toolkit before we go out into the larger community. So we've been practicing this in our beloved community, right? So that when something comes up in the larger community, that we actually have some tools that we've been practicing at home in our congregation so that we can choose the appropriate tool to use. Because there are many, many, many different ways that religious communities can show up in public. In addition to public protest, there are many, many roles that we can play as we understand. And one of the most important understandings is that we show up being the change that we want to see in the world. So UU theologian and social ethicist James Luther Adams, I bet many of you have heard of him. He talked about the prophetic church as being the kind of church that isn't pushed around by history. The prophetic church kind of makes history. So I want to invite us tonight to think about the power of if we had some gifts that we uniquely cultivated in our congregations, and then we were prepared to share these tools and gifts with the larger community, how we could actually make history in the same way that these communities in the Southern Freedom Struggle shifted the entire understanding of the United States a generation ago. So I want to invite us to think about the prophetic church identifies its gifts and shares those gifts with the larger community. We're not pushed around, especially by the media, I would say. So prophetic churches are countercultural, right? So if we understand that we live in a culture of dominance, the dominant culture is one that's kind of legalistic, right? We have this legalistic culture that assigns blame and punishment. But restorative congregations have intentional practices that are not looking to assign blame. They're looking to restore right relationship, to reclaim our humanity. So one of the things that's happening across the globe and increasingly in faith communities across this country are these practices for reclaiming our humanity. So one of the outcomes is spiritual growth. So many of you, I bet, recognize our third principle. In addition to practicing democratic principles, something like that, we promise one another to encourage one another's spiritual growth. So that's our third principle. So I'm going to give you just real quickly, what does it look like? How can we tell that we're encouraging one another's spiritual growth? And most importantly, how do I know for myself that I'm growing in my capacity to live into this beloved community vision? So the first one is the increasing capacity to just stay connected, right? Stay connected in covenant, stay connected to one another. Another indicator of spiritual growth might be being able to serve something larger than my own self. A third one could be the increasing ability to enjoy one's own life, because life is precious. And a fourth indicator of spiritual growth could be integrity, the increasing capacity to live with integrity. Even though I'm frustrated, even though we didn't get what we hoped to get with this legislative campaign, even though our congregation failed to live into covenant, we begin again in love. So those are some indicators of how we know we're living into our third principle, into our intention around spiritual growth. How do we love one another?
All right. Well, one of the ways that we can make sure that we are cultivating beloved community within our own congregations and ourselves, that then we can take it outward once we have made sure that it's happening within our own churches, is to listen carefully and compassionately. And again, this is tied to what we talked about in our webinar a couple of weeks ago, where we went over the concept of attentive listening, generous listening, and stewarding that process, stewarding the generous attentive listening as a way to restore a way of being as we're interacting together. So when we're talking about restorative, we're talking about in our UU covenantal tradition of walking together in love and trust. And how many people have been in a congregation where there's conflict that arises because some situation happens where a lack of trust develops? Certainly that's happened in my congregation. And how do we get over that? We need to listen carefully and compassionately so that we can hear where the concerns are and address those. And it doesn't mean that you address those right at that moment because you want to listen to what they're saying. You can't always formulate a response. And oftentimes a response is not necessarily needed other than I hear you and I'm listening. People have a need to be heard. And in order to move beyond some hurt or lack of trust that's happened, a huge piece of that is being compassionate in your listening. And then working through your differences once you've identified what those are, once you've listened carefully and compassionately to understand what the other person is hearing. And sometimes if it's directed at us individually, it's hard to hear what that message is. It can be difficult to not feel defensive or have our adrenaline surge a bit and have that flight response. Oh, I don't want to, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to deal with this. But if we can take a deep breath, think about the green string that Mark wears, or that, we might have a virtual green string or an actual green string that we wear, to think about what's the most generous response that I can have when I'm hearing about this difference that needs to get resolved. Another piece is infusing messages of hope and justice as part of restorative practice. That doesn't mean we sugarcoat things necessarily, but there's a lot of injustice and a lot of despair out there in the media and the messaging. What we see on the screen, either on our computers or our televisions or on our phones, on the news feeds, on blogs, are a lot of negative things. And apparently there's some data about that being a popular thing to get people to pay attention. And so that's a lot of the dominant messages out there. So when we can infuse messages of hope and justice in our own congregations, and then take those messages of hope and justice out into the wider community, that can make a huge difference in terms of what we can get accomplished and to get people motivated. Whether it's motivated to participate in a project, whether it's motivated to give financially to support a project. People don't want to give to a sinking ship, and they want to give when they know what the mission is, what the vision is. That's what they want to give to. And if you can frame that in a way that really highlights the justice that will be done from that work and the hope that is built from that work, that can be a huge piece in having restorative practice make an impact on the healing in your own community. All right, so some resources that we have about restorative practices, in addition to that, the manual that I just mentioned. And Deb, I think this is you were going to speak to these particular resources.
So the International Institute for Restorative Practices, I said earlier that there's this paradigm shift. The old ways are dying and new ways are trying to be born. And I feel passionately that one of the roles that our congregations can play are to midwife this religious vision of beloved community. And the restorative practices that this International Institute, it's based here in our country in Pennsylvania, and they sponsor a lot of workshops across the country through which we can go learn these practices. So I was talking to a colleague in the UCC church who was in St. Louis, and she said, you know, I just wish that we could come together as an interfaith community in our local communities so that when another Ferguson-like event explodes, that people say, oh, thank goodness, here come the congregations, here come the churches. They are going to help us restore right relationship. And we have those tool sets. And I just thought that was a beautiful vision for how we are prepared, including in our families, in our own congregations, but also in our communities. So I invite you to go look, and they have some free webinars. The next one is, I expect that many of you know that the UUA's common read this year is Just Mercy. And I was on the selection committee for that. And the guide, the reader's guide, discussion guide, is so beautiful. And I just saw Brian Stevenson in an interview. He's the author of Just Mercy. And he talks about, he's going to be, by the way, at General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio next summer. But he talks about becoming stone catchers. So, you know, in the Christian scriptures, there's the story of the woman that's going to be stoned by the community. And the prophet Jesus intervenes. And he says, you that are without, cast the first stone. So Brian Stevenson in this Just Mercy is talking to us about becoming stone catchers, to actually learning to catch the stone before it's thrown at another, because we practice mercy. And you know why? He says, because I believe we're more than the worst thing we've ever done. So I just want to encourage you, if your congregation hasn't taken a look at the Common Read, it's free and downloadable. And again, BeTheLove.net is our beloved community website and blog, where we blog and reflect on all the different practices for building beloved community. And I bet many of you are familiar with the Living Seven Principles Project. That's their website address. And they are actually Unitarian Universalist practitioners of compassionate communication. What Kay was talking about is another restorative practice. And again, the Center for Nonviolent Communication has so many website resources, and all of these are free at no cost. So you can become that practicing congregation, that learning community. So I just want to remind us, when we're talking about beloved community as this vision of what we want to live into, that religious communities, Unitarian Universalist congregations, have these unique gifts to contribute. Because let's just remember that we've chosen to do our social justice work as members of a faith community, because we could be up to our ears, right? In a dozen different public policy issues and never cross the threshold of a congregation. But we've chosen to do this as ministry, as members of a congregation. So I just want to invite us to remember that, because we have these unique contributions to make. We're not conveniently organized groups of people that are ready to fulfill somebody else's political agenda. Religious communities have always had a radical role to play in social change efforts. So I want to invite us to fully step into that role. And as James Luther Adams said, let's not be pushed around by history, let's make history. I looked at the list quickly of all of us that are gathered tonight, and I think most of us are from the Pacific Western region. And we have this big faith, no borders vision that we're living into. So we have big faith in beloved community, and there's no borders. So we're trying to live into this idea of moving from I church to we church, from I church to beloved community. And one way that we understand this is the architecture of our interdependence. That's actually what we're calling our regional collaboration efforts. Because in the past, and I bet this happens in a lot of places in our congregations. I know for a fact that it happens, that we kind of have things in silos. So if you're in leadership development, you might not ever talk to the faith formation, religious exploration members of your congregation. So this architecture of our interdependence offers a holistic lens through which to understand all the various ministries in our congregations, and specifically in terms of mission and in terms of our social justice ministries in our congregation. If we're looking through the lens of beloved community, then we have this opportunity to look at our various justice ministries, their relationship to one another, and most importantly, their relationship to the local context in which our congregations are situated. There's no one size fits all. And that's part of this paradigm shift that's underway, not just in Unitarian Universalism, but there's a whole shift, especially among young adults, that I see over and over again. They're recognizing that we're just not getting the results that we want, and they're looking to make this link between their spirituality, how they live out their values with integrity, and link that to their yearning for social change. So especially this paradigm shift no longer has these two things separate. And I think Unitarian Universalists are well placed to live into this vision of beloved community. So in the vision of beloved community, there is no us versus them. Oftentimes, especially toward the goal or the end of political expediency, we use wedge issues and we divide ourselves into this kind of zero-sum game where someone has to lose and someone else has to win. So in the context of beloved community, there is no us versus them. We understand that we're all in this together. And the purpose of power is not to dominate another, but to restore right relationship. We use our power to restore right relationship where our congregations are located. When we're in doubt, and we always have doubts, but I always go back to that place of what is my yearning? What is that vision? Like Mark Ewart has that green string around his wrist to remind him that he's always going to pause and ask himself, what's the most generous response I can have to this situation? Even though I'm triggered, I'm going to have big faith in our power to live into this vision of beloved community.
So what are some of the transformational practices that we can employ both within our own walls as a congregation and out when we're doing our outreach beyond our walls? So there's a statement out there that says, no matter how educated, talented, rich, or cool you believe that you are, how you treat people tells all. Integrity is everything. So we know that people can have radically different reactions to each other depending on whether they feel like they're being treated well, whether they feel like they're being listened to. And so, how do we accomplish that? So having self-awareness about, at the individual level and at the congregational level is, knowing who you are, where you came from, what it means to be you, and what your values are, and then how you carry those out into the wider community. Again, how are we distinguishing ourselves between or from all the other groups that are out there that are doing social justice work? We are a faith community. We have these 7 principles. We have our values, and we need to think about those in the context of our outreach work. So my congregation, for example, has a mission statement that says, "Empowered by love, we transform ourselves and serve our world." And I like that. I actually wasn't involved in the development of it, which is totally fine. The people who came up with this and then had the congregation vote on it, I think we're really capturing this issue of transformation and this service to the larger world that we all, as congregations, yearn to do. And so, that's a huge piece of, what is your mission as a congregation, and how does that relate to, transforming both ourselves and then the wider community. So having a covenant, we already talked about that, is an important piece. Is the covenant around your social justice work? Is it around, as Patrick suggested earlier on the blog, your particular committee meeting where you're going to have a reading at the beginning and lighting a chalice, and then having a closing words as well? That can be a piece of the covenant process. Having empathy for folks is also a huge piece of having a transformational practice. And there's a lot of information out there on the internet about how our empathy these days is being reduced. Humans' empathy for one another, and particularly for our younger generations, the capacity to build empathy is being hindered by the fact that we are online a lot, and about 80%, they say, of you understanding what the other person that you're relating to is talking about or what their emotions are is visual and audio. So that was one of the reasons why we went up for this. You can see the face of people on this webinar, as well as hear the tone of our voice. That these days folks are either anonymously blogging without seeing the impact that it's having on other people, without hearing the tone of voice. And so keeping that empathy piece front and center and making sure that we're building that in our own communities is an important piece of things, and to make sure that we are being mindful and really getting all the information that we can from the people that we're communicating with. So companioning is another piece, and it is a way to be together. Deb, did you want to jump in on that? Were you?
Sure, I'll be glad to. So we have, almost every slide that Kay and I are sharing with you, and these ideas of transformational practices that are pieces of beloved community. We could almost do a whole evening just on companioning, just on empathy, covenant, and intercultural competency. But one of the transformational practices. So a transformational practice is anything that we do changes us, right? So all the world's wisdom traditions, what they all have in common is doing things that change us. So this companioning is actually just being a witness to what's going on in one another's lives. So one of the structures that give shape to beloved community in our congregations are small group justice ministries. And that's how we go out into the world and actually engage in these public witness campaigns. And we're companioning not only our partner organizations and their members, but we're companioning one another so that when we get back to our congregation in our small group justice ministry, that we're actually reflecting on how we did as companions and what did we learn. That's what makes us a learning community. Maybe we need to engage in some intercultural competency so that we're more aware of the assumptions that we bring to our public witness efforts and how we take care of ourselves and one another. So that's the companioning and a transformational practice where the container are our small group ministries.
And then to
Kate, this
wrap
is
that
so
up,
yours.
yes, and to wrap that up into the generosity piece, again, generosity in all things. We're not just talking about the financial piece, we're talking about much, much more than that. And in fact, you know, we can even push that financial piece aside, because if we're generous in all things, all other things that aren't the financial piece, then the financial piece falls in place, right? So generous listening, generous praise and thanks, generous embracing of change, all these concepts that we went over in the previous webinar and that we've touched on a little bit today are, you know, the green string reminding us what's the most generous response I can have, even in situations that are uncomfortable, even in situations where we might not like what we're hearing. You know, how can we have a generous response that is going to transform that interaction and create something positive out of it? When we're hearing a negative statement, reflecting back, what would it look like if we did X in a way that would feel good to you? You know, we can flip that around. So having a reflection on these practices, how does your congregation integrate transformational practices into its justice ministries? And are any of the things that we had on the previous slide here, do those come into play? And if they don't, are there places where you would like those transformational practices to come into play for your social justice work? All right, so we have this beloved community outreach. So again, starting with the why, and you know, the answer may be different for each congregation, or it may be tweaked to, you know, have a little bit different feel or look to it about why we're doing this outreach. But you know, the big question here is, how does this outreach relate to our mission? And you know, how do we make sure that this outreach is really part of what we as a congregation want to be called to do and what we want to accomplish? So leading into that, we have a success story that Deb is going to share about what's been happening in Colorado.
Being clear around this architecture of our interdependence has everything to do with our clusters. And I bet many of you have sister UU congregations in geographic proximity. And sometimes we can be within 15 minutes of each other, and yet we don't yet have a network where we're actually collaborating. So that's what we're calling this interdependence, this culture of interdependence, this architecture. So this beautiful thing happened. After a few years, the Boulder-Denver cluster had been working the beloved community paradigm for 5 or 6 years. And then we had an opportunity to have an intern that was shared by the district, by the Mountain Desert District, and also with First Unitarian Denver. So we had a minister in training, and the Colorado cluster, the Boulder-Denver cluster of congregations, after she finished her internship, they recognized the value of funding this shared ministry, and they actually came together to financially and also emotionally, spiritually, and physically support her. So they came together to fund a shared ministry. And so she actually served 10 congregations in this cluster. And what do you know? The beloved community coordinator, Kirsten Homblett, our colleague, Reverend Kirsten Homblett, was ordained a year ago, January, by these 10 congregations. Imagine we had the most beautiful service where everybody witnessed to the value of her beloved community coordinator role. And they all ordained her in one congregation site on one beautiful Saturday afternoon. So I want us to think about how we can come together, not only to support and fund one ministry position that benefits all of our congregation, but Kirsten was also a bridge builder to a lot of the community-based organizations, the social change networks in the state of Colorado. And it made such a difference for Unitarian Universalism to show up in that way. And Kay's going to speak in a couple minutes about ways that these congregations leveraged their financial contributions to create this prototype, right? So they ordained this community minister, and it transformed everybody, and including our public profile, how other congregations, how other members of the interfaith community perceived Unitarian Universalism. So here's another success story. So you heard me speak about small group justice ministry and the power of covenant to kind of repair the tears in the fabric of our community, because when we're engaged in an authentic community, we're going to encounter difference, and covenant is a powerful tool for change. So in the Pacific Western region, several religious leaders and some lay leaders also have been working with the American Friends Service Committee. And one of the beautiful things that came out of the Boulder-Denver cluster collaboration around funding this shared ministry is in 2014, we were contacted by the National American Friends Service Community, and they wanted to know if they could use and borrow our small group justice ministry practices and how we used covenant. And so we actually gave them everything. We shared our gifts with the American Friends Service Committee, and now they are launching 5 pilot projects across the country to actually go deeper with their own social change ministries. So many of you, I bet, know that the American Friends Service Committee is based in the Religious Society of Friends, what we know as the Quakers. So they share our belief in the worth of every person and faith in the transforming power of love. So what do you know? There's some powerful interfaith collaborators. And then just this past month, the 2015 World Parliament of Religions was held in Salt Lake City. And one of our congregations, the South Valley congregation, south of Salt Lake City, they had already been working across denominational boundaries, crossing these borders, and their choirs had been singing together in Salt Lake City. So when the World Parliament of Religions knew that there was already some interfaith collaboration, what do you know? They commissioned Reverend Patty Willis, who's the minister of the South Valley UU congregation, to write the opening song, and it's called The Earth is Calling. You can Google it. And then she and her partner also wrote this beautiful cantata. So I just want to say that, you know, when we cross these borders, there's just this power that Unitarian Universalism can contribute to the larger community. And these are interfaith collaborations. We're crossing these borders that are, we just need each other. I'm convinced that if we had had stronger relationships in the terrible tragedy of September 11th, 9/11, I think that if we had stronger interfaith relationships, we wouldn't have been able to stop our country from going to war.
Moving to the money piece, because of course people always want to know, well, how can we fund what we're doing here in our outreach work, in addition to all the funding of our in-reach work, of our beloved community within. So the first one is you know, maybe an obvious one to you, but you know, congregations often build this work into their annual budget. So when I'm talking to congregations, I encourage them to look at their budget as a program pie, if you will. And the pieces of the pie are outreach. The pieces of the pie are worship and music. The pieces of the pie are lifespan religious education. Pieces of the pie are denominational connection, as opposed to staff salaries and building maintenance and things like that. Because all of those things, your professional staff that you have can fit into the pieces of the pie that are what your mission is about, right? Your minister helps with your denominational connections. Your minister often helps with outreach. Your minister often helps with your worship and music, and all these different pieces. So you can, in terms of your annual budget, you can look at what your outreach is, and you can say, as a congregation, we're going to devote a certain amount of our annual budget to a particular outreach project that is also being contributed to by other groups that we're partnering with. Mm-hmm. And then another piece of that is to have a special offering. If your congregation decides to have a particular outreach and social action project, you can have a special offering for that particular thing. And that can be even a little bit different than you're giving away your offering. We just gave away in my congregation this past Sunday money, our special offering to the school district lunch and school supply program for Springfield, which is right next to Eugene. And somebody came and spoke about this special program that they have. And so that's what our offering went to. But there's no one in our congregation, at least as a group, that's going out and helping with that program. We do have several other things that we go out and do as members of our church community. So this special offering would be something like, well, we want to participate in this shelter project, and we are going to take a special offering to help fund that because it's not part of our annual budget. And this is something that we've come up with that we feel like it does relate to our mission and our vision and what we want to accomplish together. So just some examples of congregations that have done things like this, having a joint soup kitchen that they operate either on their own site or that they go and help with on a rotation basis. Similarly, a joint shelter activity. I know lots of congregations that rotate and either host shelter either for during certain temperatures, or they host certain demographics for their shelter. One congregation I visited recently is part of something called Family Promise, where the families can come, up to a certain number of families can come and stay in their church on the premises, and then they rotate around to the different interfaith communities to help with all the unhoused people out there that do not have a place to be. And if in Eugene, for example, it's hard for a family to go to a place like the Mission if they want to stay together because they have gender separation for what they view as a safety concern. And so obviously there are procedures you have to put in place, but having a joint shelter activity is also another example of congregations funding that type of thing. And then thinking a little bit outside the box of these typical things that you might think of, sending a person or a team from your congregation to a regional training around leadership, around social justice, whatever it is that you want, having congregational funds dedicated to that can make a huge difference. I've talked to so many people who had who've sent people to leadership school or a training that they came back and felt like they were empowered to transform their community. They transformed themselves, right, at the leadership school where they were trained to do a particular thing. And we all know there's lots of people in our congregations that may or may not feel okay in a leadership position. Sending them to some sort of training and paying for that and having the faith in them that that they can learn at this training and come back and infuse that into your community can make a huge difference in building new leaders and building confidence in your own congregations. Another piece of funding collaborative outreach is this next piece. And Deb, I think this is your slide here.
Yeah, it is. And I'm going to kind of move through it quickly because I talked already about the impact that when we learn to work together, we move from I church to we church. So local community-based organizations, when we're in authentic partnerships with them, and again, you can find out more about all of this on bethelove.net. But one of the things that I just wanted to mention is that many of our cities, major cities certainly, have interfaith councils, and more of the capacity that we're creating to work with one another. We recognize that there are resources that we can leverage when we actually pool our gifts. So oftentimes in our congregations, the ministers of our congregations may participate in an interfaith council or some kind of ministerium. And increasingly, what's starting to happen that I witness across our Pacific Western region, but also across the country, is that in addition to the important service work that Kay mentioned, like soup kitchens and shelters, we're actually starting to work more intentionally as partners to get at some systemic change, to actually shift some of these systems, these unjust systems that are in place in our communities. So for example, living wage ordinances. Kirsten Homblett, our shared minister in Colorado on the Front Range in the Boulder-Denver cluster, she actually served on the Colorado Council of Churches. And so there was a voice there to actually engage in the larger interfaith community. And they were able to come together around some work around LGBTQ marriage equality, and just being able to weave those relationships together to serve as bridges out of our own religious integrity, and to recognize that we've got some important gifts to share. So that's all I'll say about that. But living wage ordinances and these important opportunities, such especially in this day, we're going to this important place of looking at citizen police review boards. I know that that's happening across the country, and the interfaith community have important roles to play in creating these accountability boards in our communities.
So some more funding opportunities for collaborative outreach. Some of you may have heard of this Fund for UU Social Responsibility, and there are 3 areas within that. And the first is this congregation-based community organizing. And they have matching grants up to $5,000 for congregations that are participating in a community-based organization, for both membership in it and for training. And these grants are on a rolling application basis. So you can apply for those and be considered in their regular grant cycle. And you can see, these are live links here, and I have a link at the bottom, so you can cut and paste the URL to get to this fund. But it's one of the ways that you can participate and have some money. And then we'll talk in a bit at the end here of this slide about getting some matching funds if your congregation is coming up with something related to that as well. So actions of public witness, there's a specific section in the UU Social Responsibility Fund for that. And they have grants of up to $1,500 when you're participating in actions of public witness. And they have a matching grant program for that as well, in a broad range of social and environmental action items. So again, these are available on a rolling basis, and there's the website explains how you can apply for these. They're not made to individuals, but they're made to congregations as part of our faith community and our outreach. And the third one that's funded by the Fund for UU for Social Responsibility is the statewide action networks. So these are part of the legislative ministries, and we know that there are many areas where people get together and go and organize particular activities at the legislature to have an impact on laws that are being considered, laws that are being passed, and even draft legislation to be, then they then find a sponsor, a legislative representative who can introduce that. So these grants are available for groups that are getting together and working within these statewide action networks. Then there's the link that you can cut and paste when you get this slideshow, or you can write it down now too, and get to this fund that describes more about these processes. So challenge grants are another piece of this type of action. They are an interesting animal, and I'll go ahead and put the URL up for those, because they really require contributions from new donors. And the idea behind that is that they're trying to build the capacity for you there. So people who have never given to an organization are considered. And so once you get this grant, you can, in some instances, count your existing contributions towards a challenge grant, but then they're also looking at gifts made after the date of the grant. And you can get, your award letters for these are particular, and they can help you figure out, navigate, what funds are okay to count and which funds aren't. And then, it just involves reporting to them, the amount of the money, and then getting that challenge grant. So these are, again, specifically directed at outreach activities. So you should check out that website so that you can see if there's something that you're doing in your own congregation, or as a community organizing group, or as a community minister, that can be funded by this particular funding source. Of Olympia, Washington, I know has a particular part of their mission is funding and helping with the unhoused. And not only do they have a building on their property that deals with that they've converted into its own nonprofit where people volunteer and then they actually have paid staff, but they also participate and have part of their budget allocated for one of these shared interfaith help out people who need housing, where they're on a rotation, where for 3 weeks they're on, and then they other congregations take it on for a period of 3 weeks. Where they're doing that, and that's an example of how they're doing that in their community.
I wonder how many of you have a line item in your budget. Kay mentioned supporting members in our congregation so that they can be equipped to be this beloved community change. And I wonder if any of you have leadership development allocated in your operating budgets in your congregations. How do you actually support the volunteers that do step forward in your congregation to fulfill your mission? How do you equip them so that they can be a public presence? So that's just a little seed that I'm tossing out there to think about that. I'm often surprised not to see that we actually can put people in positions of responsibility and sometimes forget that we need to support them in their mission and in their ministries.
All right, so as we wrap up here, we have just an ending piece here, a slide where we just wanted to wrap up and talk about establishing a new norm for inreach and outreach. And just to review these principles: beloved community as the framework for UU social action. We've talked about right relationships and compassionate community, restorative community, and social change as ministry, and spiritual practice and social justice, and then transformational practice, all towards this collaborative approach, both internally and then externally. We experience beloved community whenever and wherever individuals, groups, and institutions choose connection, individuality, creativity, and mindfulness over separation, individualism, destruction, and denial. Beloved community rests in the awareness that All evidence to the contrary, we belong to one another.